Environmental Economics, Lecture 3, The Economic Approach, Externalities. I'm Dr. Magda Mustafa Sadig, your instructor of Environmental Economics. In this lecture, the main points will be externality, improperly designed property rights, systems, and public goods. Exclusivity is one of the chief characteristics of inefficient property rights or property rights structure. This characteristic is frequently violated in practice. One broad class of violations occurs when an agent making a decision does not bear all of the consequences of his or her action. Suppose, for example, there are two firms that are located by a river. The first produces steel, while the second, somewhat downstream, operates a resort hotel. Both use the river, although in different ways. The steel firm uses it as a receptacle for its waste, while the hotel uses it to attract customers seeking water recreation. If these two facilities have different owners, an efficient use of the water is not likely to result, because the steel plant does not bear the cost of reduced business at the resort resulting from waste being dumped into the river. It is not likely to be very sensitive to that cost in its decision making. As a result, it could be expected to dump too much waste into the river, and an efficient allocation of the river would not be attained. This situation is called an externality. And externalities exist whenever the welfare of some agent, either a firm or household or an individual, depends not only on his or her activities, but also on activities under the control of some other agent. In the example that we presented, the increased waste in the river imposed an external cost on the resort, a cost the steel firm could not be counted upon to consider appropriately in deciding the amount of waste to dump. The effect of this external cost on the steel industry is illustrated in figure 3.1, which shows the market for steel. Steel production inevitably involves producing pollution as well as steel. The demand for steel is shown by the demand curve D, and the private marginal cost of producing the steel, exclusive of pollution control and damage, is depicted as marginal cost P. Because society considers both the cost of pollution and the cost of producing the steel, the social marginal cost function MCS includes both of these costs as well. If the steel industry faced no outside control on its emissions level, for example, there is no laws imposed to them in order to reduce this pollution level, it would seek to produce quantity M. Quantity M. That choice in a competitive setting would maximize its private producer surplus. But that is clearly not efficient since the net benefit is maximized at Q star, not QM. With the help of figure 3.1, we can draw a number of conclusions about market allocations of commodities causing pollution externalities. The output of the commodity is too large. Too much pollution is produced. The prices of products responsible for pollution are too low. As long as costs are external, no incentives to search for ways to yield less pollution per unit of output are introduced by the market. Recycling and use of polluting substances are discouraged because release into the environment is so inefficiently cheap. The effects of a market imperfection for one commodity end up affecting the demands for raw materials, labor, and so on. The ultimate effects are felt through the entire economy. Types of externalities. External effects or externalities can be positive or negative. Historically, the terms external diseconomies or diseconomy and external economy have been used to refer respectively to circumstances in which the affected party is damaged by or benefits from the externality. Clearly, the water pollution example represents an external diseconomy. External economies are not hard to find, however, private individuals who preserve a particularly scenic area provide an external economy to all who pass. Generally, when external economies are present, the market will undersupply the resources. One other distinction is important. One class, this pecuniary diseconomy, however, does not cause a market failure because the resulting higher rents are reflecting the scarcity of land. The land market provides a mechanism by which the parties can bid for land. The resulting prices reflect the value of the land in its various uses. Without pecuniary externalities, the price signals would fail to sustain an efficient allocation. The pollution example is not a pecuniary externality because the effect is not transmitted through prices. In this example, price does not or do not adjust to reflect the increasing waste load. The damage to the water resources is not reflected in the steel firm's cost. An essential feedback mechanism that is present for pecuniary externalities is not present for the pollution case. The externalities case concept is a broad one covering a multitude of sources of market failure. The next step is to investigate some specific circumstances that can give rise to externalities. The specific circumstances that can give rise to externalities include government failure, imperfect market structure, an improperly designed property rights system, imperfect market structure, has been repeated, public goods. Improperly designed property rights system. What do we mean by private property? Private property is, of course, not the only possible way of defining entitlements to resource use. Other possibilities include state property regimes, where the government owns and controls the property, and there is also common property regimes where the property is jointly owned by and managed by a specified group of co-owners. And there is also a res nullius or open access regimes in which no one owns or exercises control over the resources. All of these create rather different incentives for resource use. State property regimes exist not only in former communist countries but also to varying degrees in virtually all countries of the world. But for example, parks and forests are frequently owned and managed by the government in capitalist as well as in socialist nations. As problems with both efficiency and sustainability can rise in state property regimes when the incentives of bureaucrats who implement and or make the rules for resource use diverge from collective interest. While in common property, resources are those shared resources that are managed in common rather than in private. Entitlements to use common property resources may be formal, protected by specific legal rules, or they may be informal, protected by tradition or custom. Common property regimes exhibit varying degrees of efficiency and sustainability depending on the rules that emerge from collective decision making. While some very successful examples of common property regimes exist, unsuccessful examples are even more common. From the common successful examples of a common property regime involve the system of allocating grazing rights in Switzerland. Although agricultural land is normally treated as private property in Switzerland, grazing rights on the Alpine meadows have been treated as common property for centuries. Overgrazing is protected by specific rules enacted by an association of users which limit the amount of livestock permitted on the meadow. The families included on the membership list of the association have been stable over time as rights and responsibilities have passed from generation to generation. This stability has apparently facilitated trust, thereby providing a foundation for continued compliance with the rules. Unfortunately, that kind of stability may be the exception rather than the rule, particularly in the face of heavy population pressure. The more common situation can be illustrated by the experience of a small fishing village in Sri Lanka. Initially, a complicated but effective rotating system of fishing rights was devised by villagers to assure equitable access to the best spots and best times while protecting the fish stocks. Over time, population pressure and the infusion of outsiders raised demand and undermined the collective cohesion sufficiently that the traditional rules became unenforceable, producing overexploitation of the resource and lower incomes for all the participants. The common pool resources are shared resources characterized by non-exclusivity and divisibility. Non-exclusive implies that resources can be exploited by anyone, shared by anyone. At the same time, divisibility means that the capture of part of the resources by one group subtracts it from the amount available to the other group. So there are two characteristics of this formulation of the open access allocation are worth noting. In the presence of sufficient demand, unrestricted access will cause resources to over-exploit it, while the scarcity rent is dissipated, no one is able to appropriate the rent, so it's a loss. As for renewable property resources, the main focus of this section can be exploited on a fairest come, fairest served basis because no individual or group has the legal power to restrict access. Open access resources, as we shall henceforth call them, has given rise to what has become known popularly as the tragedy of the commons. The problems created by open access resources can be illustrated by recalling the fate of the American bisons. Bisons are an example of common pool resources. Common pool resources are shared resources, as I told you before in the previous slides, that characterized by non-exclusive and non-divisibility. And note that the contrast between the common pool resources and public goods, which is the subject of the next section, that you will identify this contrast when we come to the public goods. In the early history of the United States, bisons were plentiful. Unrestricted hunting access was not a problem. Frontier people who needed hides or meat could easily get whatever they needed. The aggressiveness of any one hunter did not affect the time and effort expended by other hunters. In the absence of scarcity, efficiency was not threatened by open access. As the years slipped by, however, the demand for bison increased and scarcity became a factor. As the number of hunters increased, eventually every additional unit of hunting activity increased the amount of time and effort required to produce a given yield of bison. Consider graphically how various property rights structures and the resulting level of harvest affect the scarcity rent. In this case, the scarcity rent is equivalent to the economic surplus received by consumer and producers, which means that scarcity rent is equal to consumer surplus plus producer surplus, where the amount of rent is measured as the difference between total revenue received from the harvest minus the total cost associated with producing the harvest. In figure 3.2, we compare the revenue and cost, mean that we compare the total revenue and the total cost for various levels of harvest. In the top panel, the total revenue is calculated by multiplying for each level of hunting activity the assumed constant price of bison by the amount harvested. The upward sloping total cost curve simply reflects that fact that increases in harvest effort result in higher total cost. The marginal cost is assumed to be constant for this example. In terms of the top panel of figure 3.2, the total surplus associated with any level of effort is measured as a vertical difference between the total revenue curve and the total cost curve for that level of harvest. Look to the bottom panel where the marginal revenue curve is downward sloping despite the constant price, because as the amount of hunting effort increases, the resulting bison population size decreases. Smaller populations support smaller harvest per unit of effort expended. The efficient level of hunting activity in this model maximizes the surplus. E1 maximizes the surplus. This can be seen graphically in two different ways. First, E1 maximizes the vertical difference between the two curves in the top panel. Second, in the bottom panel, E1 is the level where the marginal revenue, which records the addition to the surplus from an additional unit of effort, crosses the marginal cost curve, which measures the reduction in the surplus due to the additional cost of expending that last unit of effort. These are two simply different mathematically equivalent ways to demonstrate the same outcome. The curves in the bottom panel are derived from the curves in the top panel, with all hunters having completely unrestricted access to bison. The resulting allocation would not be efficient. No individual hunter would have an incentive to protect scarcity rent by restricting hunting effort. Individual hunters without exclusive rights would exploit the resource until their total benefit equaled or equal to total cost, implying a level of effort equal to E2. Excessive exploitation of the herd occurs because individual hunters cannot appropriate the scarcity rate. Therefore, they ignore it. One of the losses from the further exploitation that could be avoided by exclusive owners, the loss of scarcity rate due to overexploitation. This is not part of the decision-making process of open access hunters. So, as I told you, there are two characteristics of this formulation of the open access allocation are worth noting, as we mentioned before in the previous slides. In the presence of sufficient demand, unrestricted access will cause resources to be overexploited. And the scarcity rate is this betted, no one is able to appropriate the rate, so it's lost. Ya Ibrahim, why does this happen? Because unlimited access destroys the incentives to reserve. A hunter who can preclude others from hunting his stocks has an incentive to keep the herd at an efficient level. This restraint results in lower cost in the form of less time and effort expended to produce a given yield of bison. On the other hand, a hunter exploiting an open access resource would not have an incentive to conserve because the potential additional economic surplus derived from self-restraint. And to some extent, be captured by other hunters who simply kept harvesting. Thus, unrestricted access to resources promotes an inefficient allocation. As a result of excessive harvest and the loss of habitat, as land was converted to farm and pasture, the Great Plains bison herds nearly became extinct. Public goods, defined as those that exhibit both consumption indivisibilities and non-excludability, present a particularly complex category of environmental resources. Non-excludability refers to circumstances where once the resource is provided, even those who fail to pay for it cannot be excluded from enjoying the benefit it confers. Consumption is said to be indivisible when one person's consumption of a good does not diminish the amount available for others. Several common environmental resources are public goods, including not only the charming landscape referred to by Emerson, but also clean air, clean water, and biological diversity. Biological diversity includes two related concepts: the amount of genetic variability among individuals within a single species and the number of species within a community of organisms. Genetic diversity, critical to species survival in the natural world, has also proved to be important in the development of new crops and livestock. It enhances the opportunities for crossbreeding and thus the development of superior strains. The availability of different strains was a key, for example, in developing new disease-resistant barley. Because of the interdependence of species within ecological communities, any particular species may have a value to the community far beyond its intrinsic value. Certain species contribute balance and stability to their ecological communities by providing food sources or holding the population of the species in check. The richness of diversity within and among species has provided new sources of food, energy, industrial chemicals, raw materials, and medicines. Yet considerable evidence suggests that biological diversity is decreasing. Can we rely on the private sector to produce the efficient amount of public goods such as biological diversity? Unfortunately, the answer is no. Suppose that in response to diminishing ecological diversity, we decide to take up a collection to provide some means of preserving endangered species. Would the collection yield sufficient revenue to pay for an efficient level of ecological diversity? The general answer is no. Let us see why. In figure 3.3, individual demand curves for preserving biodiversity have been presented for two consumers, A and B. The market demand curve is represented by the vertical summation of the two by the vertical summation of the two individual demand curves. A vertical summation is necessary because everyone can simultaneously consume the same amount of biological diversity. We are therefore able to determine the market demand by finding the sum of the amounts of money they would be willing to pay for that level of diversity. What is the efficient level of diversity? It can be determined by a direct application of our definition of efficiency. The efficient allocation maximizes economic surplus, as we mentioned before in previous slides, which is represented geometrically by the portion of the area under the demand curve that lies above the constant marginal cost. Look to the horizontal line OA plus OB, which is the marginal demand marginal cost curve. Above the constant cost curve, the allocation that maximizes economic surplus is Q star. The allocation where the demand curve crosses the marginal cost curve. Why would a competitive market not be expected to supply the efficient level of this good? Since the two consumers get very different marginal willingness to pay from the efficient allocation of this good, OA versus OB, the efficient pricing system would require charging a different price to each consumer. Person A would pay OA, and person B would pay OB. Remember, consumers tend to choose the level of the good that equates their marginal willingness to pay to the price they face. Yet, the producer would have no basis for figuring out how to differentiate the prices. In the absence of excludability, consumers are not likely choose to reveal the strengths of their preferences for this commodity. All consumers have an incentive to understate the strengths of their preferences to try to shift more of the cost burden to other consumers. Therefore, inefficiency results because each person is able to become a free rider on the other's communication. A free rider on the other's contribution. A free rider is someone who drives the value from a commodity without paying an efficient amount for its supply, because of the consumption indivisibility and non-excludability properties of the public good. Consumers receive the value of any diversity purchased by other people. When this happens, it tends to diminish incentives to contribute, and the contributions are not sufficiently large to finance the efficient amount of the public good. It would be undersupplied. Thank you, my student, for listening to me. In the coming lecture, we will complete the other reasons for externalities.